If you play video games, chances are you're familiar with PlayStation. Now entering its 5th generation, the PlayStation brand has become one of the most recognizable in all of gaming. But its success was anything but a foregone conclusion. Launched in late 1994 in its home territory of Japan, the Sony PlayStation started life as yet another player in the crowded home console market, before rocketing to worldwide success by the turn of the century. It's easy to take its success for granted, but if you didn't live through the rise of PlayStation, you may not fully appreciate its accomplishments. Which is why today, on this episode of DF Retro, we're rewinding back to the launch of the original PlayStation. We'll discuss Sony's history in the gaming industry, the state of console gaming in the mid-90s, the PlayStation's launch across Japan, North America, and Europe, all while comparing and contrasting every single launch title. So join us as we look back at the PlayStation during its early days and relive this historic time in gaming together. By the 1980s, the Sony Corporation had established itself as a major player in the home electronics market. From televisions to hi-fi to portable music players and beyond, Sony's products were recognizable and respected the world over. At the same time, Sony was beginning to look beyond just building the machines that would play your media. They wanted to publish it as well. Sony already had an established foothold in the music industry, but there were other avenues to explore going forward. I'm talking about video games, of course. After all, by the mid-80s, Nintendo and its partners had already found a lot of success with the family computer console. Anecdotes from this time suggest that Sony execs weren't really all in on video games, but there was money to be made, and publishing arrangements got underway. Starting in 1986, Sony would begin publishing games on platforms including the MSX computers and Nintendo's Famicom. Seikima 2 Akuma no Gyakusho is one such example, one of their earlier games. It's a Famicom game released in 1986 focused around a band of the same name. Sony also published titles such as Golf Force by HAL, along with multiple sports titles on the MSX, just to name a few. But in the West, Sony became more well known for the ImageSoft brand, a California-based subsidiary that spun off from the CBS Sony group. Starting with Super Dodgeball from Technos Japan, Sony ImageSoft would release a wide range of games, often based on film properties. Some were good, others perhaps less so, but it's important to understand that in the West, this was the main perception of Sony as a games publisher at the time. When you thought about Sony and games, you thought of this logo right here. Before all this, however, an engineer at Sony Japan named Ken Kutaragi had quietly built up a partnership with Nintendo to develop an audio coprocessor for use in Nintendo's then next-generation Super Famicom, also known as the Super NES. The development of the SPC 700 chip, as it was known, was seemingly unpopular with Sony management of the time, but President Norio Oga allowed Kutaragi to complete his work. It was thanks to Sony then that Nintendo's 16-bit console sounded the way it did. Ultimately, this initial partnership led to the now infamous Super NES CD-ROM debacle. You know how this goes. CD-ROM was fast becoming a very popular medium at the time. NEC was first to market with its PC Engine CD-ROM system. Sega was of course working on the Mega CD/Sega CD, and naturally, Nintendo wanted to ensure that it would be ready with a new product as well. And this is where Sony's engineering experience came into play. They were one of the two main creators of the compact disc format after all. Thus, Kutaragi and team worked to create the Super Disc format, which would become an add-on or standalone unit designed to play CD-ROM based Super NES games. One of these Nintendo PlayStation, as it was called, prototypes even surfaced back in 2015. Really, this whole situation comes down to what happened back at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991. Nintendo went on stage during one of its press conferences and announced a partnership to create a new CD-ROM based format with Philips rather than Sony. Yet the day prior, Sony had announced its own partnership with Nintendo to create the new Super Disc based consoles. The story here is that Nintendo wasn't entirely satisfied with the proposed royalty scheme around the Super Disc, and Yamauchi and crew basically ran to the other major player in the compact disc space, Philips, in an attempt to stick it to Sony, so to speak. It didn't really work. Philips did get a chance to work with Nintendo, of course, but we all know how that goes.
Yes, the CDI would be the home for many of our favorite games, including Hotel Mario, Zelda 1 Gamelon, Zelda's Adventure, Thunder Paradise, and my favorite single-player experience, The Joy of Sex.
But as for Sony, well, this might have been the end of their little excursion into the world of console gaming, but instead, with Oga's permission, Kutaragi started work on a standalone system instead. Known as the PlayStation X during development, Kutaragi and team set out to build a new box, aiming to deliver next-generation 3D graphics while leveraging the power of the Sony Corporation to ensure that it would become a success. But here's the thing, the console space back in the early 90s was absolutely congested with competition. Just think about it for a second. We already had established consoles with the Super NES, the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, and the PC Engine in Japan, but during the development of PlayStation, we saw the release of consoles such as the Atari Jaguar, the 3DO, add-ons for Sega's 16-bit machine, and even multimedia boxes such as the CDI or the consoleized Amigas and FM Town systems. Most of these consoles saw little success, and in the case of 3DO, another Japanese electronics giant, Panasonic, was even associated with the manufacturing of it. Beyond that, it was widely known at this point that Nintendo, Sega, and NEC, with its very successful PC Engine line, all had next-generation consoles in development. So what the heck would Sony even know about video games? The important point here is that Sony quickly identified key areas where they needed to succeed. They needed a powerful machine with compelling software and strong marketing. They also needed strong partnerships with developers and to deliver a friendly development environment to ensure an ease of development for those developers. The big thing though is that the PlayStation would represent a major shift in game development with a push towards 3D. Now, Sega and Namco and others had already made 3D polygon graphics popular in the arcade with titles such as Sega's Virtua Fighter. This cutting-edge arcade hardware gave us an idea of where the industry was going, and this is precisely what Sony wanted to bring home, at least within reason. In the lead-up to release then, Sony made some serious power moves. They acquired the UK-based Psygnosis, which would contribute both software and, along with SN Systems, would help develop the PsyQ development kits for the PlayStation. They would also form strong partnerships with key Japanese developers such as Namco, Konami, Squaresoft, and Capcom. They knew that if they were to succeed, they needed the software to back it up. PlayStation would finally arrive in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, changing the landscape of gaming forever. The PlayStation arrived in Japan along with 8 games at a suggested retail price of 39,800 yen. It found success out of the gate, though at the time the also recently launched Sega Saturn was performing slightly better, due in part, I'd imagine, to the conversion of the ultra-popular Virtua Fighter being one of its launch games. There's little doubt, however, that this was the beginning of an exciting new era. Right from the start, it was clear that PlayStation was different. With With its slim gray chassis, the experience of Sony's industrial design team was plain to see. Its form evoked the consumer electronics Sony was known for in a way that most game consoles at the time really didn't. It was a sleek, beautiful design with a subtle color accent around its logo. The CD-ROM drive takes center stage with a large round opening along with 3 circular buttons complementing it. It's important to consider first impressions when talking about new console designs. It may seem pedestrian by today's standards, but the PlayStation was fresh and enticing in 1994. It's also one of the first consoles to rely entirely on swappable memory cards for save game storage, and each save stored on these cards received its own bespoke icon visible from within the memory card manager. A nice touch, and how about that color scheme? The PlayStation also shipped with a then fascinating new controller design with long handles extruding from each side, along with curious shapes representing the buttons. The basic layout is built upon what Nintendo had created with the Super NES, but adds an extra set of shoulder buttons to the mix along with the aforementioned handles. Although a single piece of plastic, the segmented design of the D-pad was less than optimal in this original controller. It's something that would improve in time, however. Inside, the PlayStation houses a MIPS R3000 compatible CPU clocked at just over 33 MHz. The GTE, or Geometry Transformation Engine coprocessor contained within the CPU was used to accelerate 3D operations. It features 2 MB of EDO memory, along with additional frame buffer and SPU RAM. The Toshiba-designed graphics processor offers a wide range of features and output options that were extremely competitive for its day, not to mention a very powerful sound processing unit resembling a next-generation take on the SPC 700. Naturally, the PlayStation also shipped with a 2x speed optical disc drive. While it has its limitations, many of which we'll see in this video, Kutaragi and team made a lot of smart decisions at the time, and the console offered solid 2D and 3D performance at a competitive price, and it was developer friendly. Which brings us to the reason you'd buy a console in the first place: the games. If you were purchasing a brand new PlayStation on day one in Japan, this is what you would have had in store. Welcome to Ridge City, home of the very first PlayStation game, SLPS 00001. This is the game that redefined expectations on what was possible with home console racing games. With its lush 3D graphics, smooth frame rate, and pounding soundtrack, Ridge Racer came remarkably close to capturing the arcade experience at home. This is also the beginning of what would become one of my favorite racing game series of all time, a series that would persist for nearly 20 years after this original game. But to fully appreciate what Namco delivered, you have to consider the state of 3D racing games on consoles circa 1994. If you were playing on a Super NES or Sega Genesis, 1994 introduced a pair of rather impressive polygonal racing games. Firstly, a port of Virtua Racing on the Mega Drive, which launched in early '94, alongside Stunt Race FX on Super NES, which was powered by the Super FX chip. Both were a far cry from the likes of Race Drive and from Atari, but while additional chips embedded into the cartridge allowed these games to make significant strides, they still ran at obscenely low frame rates with relatively simplistic visuals. But there were other more powerful machines in the market by this point. The Atari Jaguar asks players to do the math, but racing fans weren't exactly well served here. Its two 3D polygonal racing games, Checkered Flag and Club Drive, were seemingly both released just a week or so before the PlayStation launched in Japan. These are not good games, nor visually impressive, and the less said about the frame rate, the better. The 3DO, though, put up more of a fight with impressive titles such as Road and Track Presents The Need for Speed and Crash and Burn. But despite the impressive visuals, both these games ran at roughly 20 frames per second or worse. But then comes Ridge Racer on the PlayStation, which not only delivers a more visually striking presentation all around, but it manages to do it at a near perfect 30 frames per second. It may not seem like much today, but there really wasn't anything even remotely comparable at the time. Ridge Racer kicked the figurative doors off the competition. It's also an exceptionally well-made game to boot, with top-tier drift mechanics and excellent track design. Granted, there's not a lot of content here, it's pretty much just variations on a single track, but this was an arcade game at home. Or was it? Well, that's the thing. In my memory, Ridge Racer was pretty close to matching that arcade original, but in reality, when you put them side by side, it's really not quite there. The arcade game features higher resolution textures, increased geometric detail, and both a higher frame rate and resolution. The home version falls short, but considering the cost of the machine and the state of home racing games, it was still the most impressive thing on the market. It is worth noting that exactly 4 years after the release of the original Ridge Racer, Namco released Ridge Racer High Spec, a bonus disc included with Ridge Racer Type 4. While limited to a head-to-head race only, Ridge Racer High Spec showcased the evolution in Namco's abilities when working on the system. The game now runs in a higher resolution interlaced mode at 60 frames per second. Rendering quality on the cars and environments has also improved slightly. It's a perfect example of how console games can evolve post-launch. But there's more. It's easy to take for granted these days, but this new generation of consoles seriously improved the audio side of things. Obviously there's the CD format itself. Ridge Racer uses Redbook audio for music playback, and due to the small size of the game, all the required data is loaded at startup, allowing you to remove and replace the disc with a different music CD of your choice. But the PlayStation's SPU also enables crystal clear digital sample playback, so sound effects and voice clips are of high quality as well. The soundscape was a huge part of its appeal, that's for sure. Now, control-wise, Ridge Racer plays like a dream with the D-pad, but Namco offered an alternative solution soon after launch with the Nekketsu driving controller. With 4 analog buttons and a twist-to-turn action, it feels remarkably satisfying, yet less clunky than a full-on racing wheel in your living room. Oh, and we can't forget to mention the loading sequence, right? When you first boot Ridge Racer, you're greeted by Galaxian. Well, at least a minigame version. Namco actually patented the concept of using minigames to mask loading, and that patent only expired as of 2015. But it is something that they would use many times over going forward. Now, before we move on to our next game, we should briefly talk about one of the visible flaws that you may have noticed when playing Ridge Racer: visible texture warping. This applies to basically all 3D games on the PlayStation, and it comes down to the way the system draws and sorts its polygons. PlayStation lacks a Z buffer, which would be used to determine depth information, and as a result, when textures are applied to the polygons, at least as they're drawn on the PlayStation, they're interpreted linearly in screen space, resulting in visible distortion. This is compounded by the lack of floating point operations. All calculations in 3D are done using integers, which reduces the precision in polygon rendering. Combined, this results in noticeable polygon jittering and texture warping that would come to define the PlayStation. In 1994 though, these sorts of hard decisions were necessary to get the price of the hardware down, and all different consoles released during this period exhibit their own unique flaws as well. Still, despite this, just seeing a real 3D cityscape moving at a smooth 30 frames per second was mind-blowing. The journey through Ridge City is a memorable one, and this was a great way to kickstart the PlayStation. But the next game is something a little different. The Konami PlayStation legacy begins right here with SLPS 00002, Gokujyou Parodius Da Deluxe Pack. If Ridge Racer was all about showcasing what was possible in 3D, Parodius demonstrates what can be done with classical pixel art. This disc includes the first 2 arcade titles in the Parodius series, Parodius Da Shinwa Kara Owarae and Gokujyou Parodius Kako no Eiko o Matomete. At its core, Parodius is effectively a parody of Gradius, but also so much more. Pulling in wild imagery and music from so many directions, this is basically a celebration of all things Konami, circa 1994. It's also a brilliant set of shooters. With Gradius mechanics serving as the base, Parodius allows players to select from a wide range of characters or ship types, each with their own attack styles and power-ups. You'll play through a selection of colorful stages on your way to the end. It's excellent. It's also a nice demonstration of PlayStation's 2D prowess. Both arcade games are presented with their original artwork and sound completely intact, and that's key here. Until the arrival of Saturn and PlayStation, arcade games like this were always trimmed down to fit within the confines of consoles of this era. Note that I didn't say arcade perfect though. It is close, really close in fact, but there are some minor differences. For instance, the background color grading in Gokujyou Parodius appears to be somewhat smoother in the original arcade game compared to the PlayStation conversion, though the rest of the art is intact. Parodius Da also exhibits a slightly different output resolution. According to the PS1 Digital's menu, the PlayStation version switches to the system's 256 pixel wide output mode, the same as Super Famicom in fact. The arcade game, however, runs at 288 by 224. As a result, there is a 32 pixel reduction in screen real estate, something you can see here. Note how in this position more of the stage is visible in the arcade game. The thing is, Gokujyou Parodius also shares the same 288 by 224 resolution in the arcade, but in this case, Konami opted to present the game using a 320 pixel wide mode instead on PlayStation, resulting in additional black bars on the left and right of the image, while preserving all pixel data, so you don't lose anything with this one. Still, aside from minor quirks like this, these games were very close to matching the arcade version, which was a big deal. So how does it stack up against prior console versions? Well, Parodius Da, the 1990 game, had the most ports, and here's just a few of them. The premier port of this era is certainly the Super Famicom version. It's excellent and offers an experience that is surprisingly close to the arcade game, but if you look closely, you'll see that much of the art has been altered slightly. While PlayStation and Super Famicom both share the same 256 pixel output, the modified art on Super Famicom attempts to match the arcade version's playfield size, while PlayStation, which uses the actual arcade artwork, simply stretches the aspect ratio slightly. This becomes super evident when the first boss appears. He's slightly off screen on PlayStation, when in reality he should fit within the play space in both arcade and Super Famicom versions. The next stage also shows a significant difference in terms of background complexity. There's simply a lot more going on in the PlayStation version. Again, just like the arcade original. Now, there were other ports during this era as well. The PC Engine version is pretty good, but not quite on par with the Super NES version. With its reduced parallax background scrolling, simplified color scheme, and lower detail in its tile set, it doesn't quite stack up, but still, it's pretty good for the platform. Even Game Boy received a port of Parodius Da, and honestly, it's surprisingly excellent. And Audi would never forgive me if I didn't mention the Famicom version of the game as well, which, given the hardware, is a pretty darn impressive port. Gokujyou Parodius also received a Super Famicom conversion, which was released just before the launch of PlayStation. It's impressive, but again, it's missing some of the detail available in the PlayStation conversion, which in turn is just pulled straight from the arcade game. Also, some of the effects, such as the fading in of background elements here, they're missing on Super Famicom as well. The point here is that the PlayStation brought the arcade versions of these games to home consoles for the first time. In May of the following year, however, Konami also released the same deluxe pack on the Sega Saturn, which brings us to our very first Saturn vs PlayStation battle. And this game kinda hints at Saturn's superior performance in 2D games. Firstly, Parodius Da. It's nearly the same between the two, with only one difference. Saturn does not support a 256 pixel wide output mode, so in this case, the Saturn version now displays more of the stage than the arcade original, filling the full 320 pixel wide frame. So in this case, the Saturn version is even superior to the arcade original. Other than that though, they're basically identical. With Gokujyou Parodius, Saturn has multiple advantages here. Firstly, once again we have expanded screen real estate. This time though, both use a 320 wide output mode. The difference here is that the Saturn draws more of the stage than the arcade or PS1 version. So yeah, once again, better than arcade. It is worth noting that in the Saturn version, you can toggle between full or arcade mode, so if you want to reduce your viewport, you have the option to do so. This option is not available on the PlayStation. Some of the effects that are missing on PlayStation have also been restored on the Saturn, such as the wavy line effect in the background layer here. But there's more. On PlayStation, specifically with Gokujyou Parodius, you'll encounter minor slowdown and screen tearing in specific stages, with a reduction in gameplay speed when this occurs. The Saturn version in comparison is virtually flawless. Now if I slow the game down to 50% speed, take a close look at the top of the screen in the PlayStation version here. See what I mean? There's screen tearing. If we do the same on Sega Saturn though, it looks just fine in comparison. Now to be fair, it's worth keeping in mind that the PlayStation version is a launch title, that means it likely faced a tighter deadline. We know that later Deluxe Pack releases on PlayStation were also improved over this one, so things definitely got better, but it is interesting to see how the Saturn and PlayStation versions stack up in the context of this launch period. Even with these minor flaws on the PlayStation though, Parodius is still an excellent addition to the lineup, and in retrospect, one of the very best games to launch with the PlayStation. It's still just as amazing today as it was back in 1994, and is definitely worth playing today. You know what's not worth playing though? This is TAMA, Adventurous Ball in Giddy Labyrinth, SLPS 00003. On the surface, there really isn't a lot to say about this one, but then you realize TAMA is the only 3D multi-platform game that launched alongside both Saturn and PlayStation. Can you imagine releasing a game at launch on both of these systems? Time Warner Interactive, the studio previously known as Tengen, sure can, and that's exactly what they did. TAMA is effectively a physics-driven maze game that has players rolling the titular ball around the playing field in search of the goal. While the idea of such a game being released for a console at full price may seem absurd today, I can kinda see the logic behind it. TAMA kind of occupies a space similar to, say, multimedia reference CDs of the 90s. It's basically a 3D toy that you can mess with. It's not especially fast-paced or exciting, but I mean, look at it. It was fully 3D on your TV, and you could control it. That's pretty much the selling point here, I'd imagine. Visually, it's not exactly Ridge Racer, but it's not that bad. Most of the objects are flat shaded, with only the table itself leaning on textures. In that sense, it still manages to look reasonably clean. It's also backed by a rather sleepy but pleasant soundtrack on top of that. What surprises me about TAMA though, is that there are actual differences between Saturn and PlayStation. Being that it's an early 3D game, I really didn't expect a lot from the Saturn version, knowing how difficult it is to develop for, but as it turns out, it's kind of the better version. What do I mean? Well, firstly, take a look at the background layer behind the playfield. Notice how on PlayStation it's a completely static, poorly scaled image. On Saturn, however, the developers seem to use VDP2 to draw this background, allowing for scaling and tilting, which means as you move the table around in 3D, the background moves too, lending it an increased sense of depth. Beyond this, the space below the table displays a shadow on the Saturn, but not on PlayStation. The most unexpected twist though is this. Look closely at the table in the shadowed area on Saturn. You can actually see the background layer through it. It would seem that there's some kind of subtle transparency effect here that isn't even implemented on the PlayStation. Imagine that, the first multi-platform game between the two has transparency on Saturn but not PlayStation. That's the complete opposite of what you'd expect. Now of course this is only really feasible, I'd imagine, due to the reliance on VDP2 as the background layer. The system can seemingly blend these together. Really though, despite these curious differences, the game really isn't impressive on either platform. The concept itself isn't necessarily bad, but those sluggish ball physics make for a rather tedious gameplay experience. This is just one game that doesn't really hold up. The next one though, well, see for yourself.
Crime Crackers comes courtesy of MediaVision, a company that would be instrumental in laying a lot of the groundwork of what consumers' visual identity of the PlayStation would be in their eventual output in the West later on. Though here in their first efforts on the platform, they burst onto the scene with a pretty surprising hybrid. Part first-person shooter, part dungeon-crawling RPG, Crime Crackers sees you take part in an intergalactic scuffle as the Pink Dolphin, a team of crackers seeking bounties and rewards in the wake of a war that ended long ago. The team consists of 3 members, Emilia, Duran, and Lisa, all with their unique abilities and backstory of how they ended up where they are. It's all quite fascinating. Crime Crackers is a rare Japanese-developed attempt of what can loosely be seen as a fast-paced first-person shooter, though with a quite unique and surprisingly simple control scheme. Each stage takes the team to a maze of corridors, and enemies of varying degrees of size and dexterity are there to stop the team from progressing. Push the square button then, and you bring up the crosshair, activating the battle mode. In this mode, the D-pad moves the crosshair, while the shoulder buttons are used to strafe around the playfield in full 3D to avoid all the attacks. For more close-range combat, pushing the L2 and R2 button lets you defend yourself against oncoming fire and set up some helpful counterattacks. Between the 3 characters that can be changed with the select button, your offensive strategy will vary greatly based on this. Emilia is a straight shooter with rapid fire, Duran is a powerhouse with a slower but much stronger line of fire, while Lisa is a close combat swordswoman who's primed for melee combat. Making use of these differences is key to overcoming the enemy offensive, as the game gets progressively more challenging and introduces new enemies across the stages that you gotta take out in different ways. Each character can also make use of the unique power bomb attack, which usually will clear the screen. At the end of each stage then, a boss battle awaits with some 1-on-3 action. In between stages, a shop system can be accessed, and here the characters can be upgraded by buying and selling your old equipment and increasing their stats on their weapons and on their armor. This system is more akin to the dungeon crawler genre and lends some nice variety to the overall game, as your weapons and projectiles will change as you upgrade. During the game, these upgrades can be accessed from the menu screen, and items can also be used for temporary boost of power, health refills, and even plot device items that need to be used in specific places can be found here. Despite the differences in combat, Crime Crackers still shares a lot with its Western counterparts in the FPS genre and isn't a complete departure, however. The stages will still focus on exploration, keys and colored cards must be located in order to progress, and the action is pretty fast-paced, much like Doom for example. Where Crime Crackers does deviate, however, is the sheer focus on story throughout the game. Whereas the Space Marine or the Soldier of War, seen in its Western counterparts, runs through the stages having the bloodletting and visceral slaughter play out the internal drama, Crime Crackers makes extensive use of dialogue and story throughout the engaged player. Between stages, long cutscenes will play out to set the stage of events, and even the stages themselves, the characters will communicate with one another, or who they meet up with in the stage like the bosses. Some stages exist solely as a story-moving vehicles even. Graphically, Crime Crackers might just be one of the strongest of all the launch game. Running in PlayStation's high-resolution 512x240 mode, the fully 3D stages and enemy characters are rendered in a small window, with the 3 playable characters making up the HUD and screen frame. This slightly smaller window and obscuring perspective allows for some quite smooth gameplay and performance, with minimal texture warping and pretty sharp texture work overall on the locations and especially the enemy models. The sound, handled by Noriyuki Asakura of Tenchu fame, is quite effective as well, with some pretty cracking music that mixes rock, string instrumentation, and jazz. Just take a listen to this. So while it's interesting and surprisingly easy to play, Crime Crackers is not without its flaws. The maze design can be tedious to navigate, even with the unlockable maps that you get eventually, and the battle mode, which is an interesting idea to allow for both precision in combat and in navigation separately, it's often with this slight delay when you press it, and the sheer finger placement on the controller is gonna leave you open to surprise attacks most of the time. The game tries to mix up the monotony of all this with some different scenarios and goals that can be accomplished during a stage, but after a while, a corridor is a corridor, and there's only so much fun that can be had within that game. Perhaps most surprising, and I suspect this is an aspect that doesn't really concern most of the audience watching this, is the lack of voice acting. Yes, this game would have been a prime candidate to make use of the newfangled CD format and actually include some voice acting, considering the lengthy cutscenes that play out throughout the entire game with dialogue and interplay between these characters. It would have been greatly aided by having some voice to drive home the humor and drama of all this. Archaic and a bit clumsy, Crime Cracker sports a ton of charm though, and it's certainly a welcome addition to the PlayStation launch in Japan, and it would even get a sequel down the line, though I think that's a story for another day. It's an interesting game, and actually a somewhat missed opportunity, as I think it would have found an audience on the PlayStation outside Japan for the other launch territories, especially considering what we did get in the FPS space at launch instead. But enough about Crime Crackers, let's get cracking on to the next game. AV Evolution, or Aresha the Ikoyon Evolution, or just A4 for short, is an entry into the transportation sim series that saw its beginnings on the home computer systems in Japan, such as the PC-98, and is probably more affectionately known as the A-Train series by its fans. It's a long-running series in Japan and even got a Western release back in the day as Railroad Empire, and is still around to this day. These games are quite strict simulation games, and this console version is no different, throwing you into brutal management of the day-to-day task of connecting cities, people, and industries via the road systems. Evolution packs most of the content from the PC version of the game, albeit with a slight aesthetical update as well as the sound, though its greatest addition to the series has to be the window mode, generating a 3D view from either the cars or the trains. The players can kick back and spectate on their constructions. This was such an impactful addition that it would go on to influence future entries in the series, and yeah, it's pretty neat, don't you think? Alright, so enough of the excitement. A4 Evolution is a good simulation game, though it goes without saying that it's a game for enthusiasts, so it's not for everyone. The game came in two variations at launch, the standard game and the launch Genteiban, which came with extensive documentation, a mousepad, and the PlayStation mouse, a peripheral we haven't really talked about so far, but is woefully underused for the system. The eventual upgrade to this version, A4 Evolution Global, would actually release in the US and Europe, along with the mouse and mousepad. This may not be the most exciting release at the launch of the PlayStation, but it does highlight the system's ability to deliver PC-like experiences on a home console, and that's quite worth noting. And even today, A4 is still fondly remembered in Japan, helped by the fact that the theme song to the game, Machikado no Onna, is still quite popular with game music enthusiasts and does show up a lot on compilations and fan arrangements. Though for myself, I think I'm gonna stick to Densha to Go for my PlayStation train needs.
Nekketsu Oyako is PlayStation's very first side-scrolling brawler, and you'd be forgiven if you thought this was created by Technos Japan, creator of Double Dragon, since it looks a lot like something they might make, but no, this is instead the work of Thunder Force developer Technosoft. Alas, Nekketsu Oyako is nowhere near the caliber of Technosoft's usual fare. This isn't a bad game, just very average. From what we can tell, it seems likely that this game started life on Nintendo's Super Famicom. It definitely has a similar look. So how does it play? Well, each of the three available characters has their own unique handling, and like a good brawler, the core mechanics feel pretty solid. Plus, you have a quarter circle attack and various other techniques at your disposal. Problem is, the stages themselves are generally boring, and enemy types and patterns aren't as interesting as you might like for a game like this. There's precious little variety. Every stage is pretty much just a horizontal line. The best brawlers tend to mix things up in terms of stage design, but that's not the case here. Sure, the idea of fighting your way through the inside of a whale sounds like a good old time on paper, but in reality, it's kind of a slog. And there's a reason for that. Despite its relatively simplistic visuals, Nekketsu Oyako exhibits a lot of slowdown on PlayStation. Numerous battles throughout the game run in slow motion, increasing the amount of time spent brawling and drawing out what should have been fast-paced battles. The persistence of this slowdown basically spoils the fun. Now, Parodius already demonstrated what the PlayStation could offer over 16-bit machines in 2D, but what about Nekketsu Oyako? Well, it does feature relatively large sprites with a decent number of animation frames, and it uses the PlayStation's alpha blending features to create various special effects. But at the same time, it looks like a game that could have worked on, say, the Super Famicom. Honestly though, if the game didn't slow down, it would be perfectly fine. Audio-wise, again, no boundaries are pushed here. The music isn't nearly as impressive as Technosoft's Mega Drive titles, but it's not bad. There are some good tracks in here. As with Parodius and TAMA, however, Nekketsu Oyako was also released on the Sega Saturn. It was not, however, a launch title for the Saturn. The Sega version came out in 1995, months after the PlayStation launch, and it shows. I was surprised to see such variation in visual quality between the two. Primarily, the color palette on Saturn has been altered throughout. It's subtle in certain stages, but more noticeable in others, and basically offers a punchier look on the Saturn, which in this case, I kinda prefer. Another difference lies in the handling of transparency. Light cones, special moves, and water, among other things, all rely on PlayStation's support for alpha blending, while on Saturn, due to how these objects work, they rely instead on dithered transparency. Given the art style though, I kinda feel as if the dithering works better in this case, but ultimately, it's a matter of preference. Inside the whale, the differences are more profound. On PlayStation, the background layer slowly warps and pulsates to give the impression of a living creature. On Saturn, this effect is not used, and instead the developers have implemented some sort of line-scrolling technique to create the illusion of a circular tunnel representing the beast's digestive tract, I suppose. Either way, it looks great. In several other areas, the PlayStation version features color cycling on distant water, while on Saturn, it's static in comparison, which is one advantage in favor of Sony's machine. If we skip to this roller coaster section though, note how the two center tracks were removed on Saturn, which I suppose makes more sense logically, but in its place we have additional cloud sprites scrolling by as you play through this section. Other changes include a strong full-screen glow effect used while brawling in the lava stage on Saturn, while breakable walls have a visible top on Sega's machine and break apart slightly differently. This isn't even the full list of changes, but you get the idea. The real advantage in favor of Saturn though lies in its performance. Basically the game runs better on the Saturn. And it matters in this game, as when the frame rate drops, all frames are still drawn. It just takes longer, meaning that the game runs in slow motion. On PlayStation, many of the game's battles struggle to maintain 60 frames per second, leading to sluggish gameplay. It's not perfect on Saturn, but it's a lot closer to locking to 60 throughout these sequences. It's just a lot less frustrating to play on Saturn due to this increased speed. You can really see it here during this roller coaster battle, which highlights that, like Parodius, there is actually mild screen tearing on the PlayStation side as well as slowdown. So in terms of overall gameplay speed and visual quality, the Saturn version has the edge all around. So yeah, I'm a little surprised by this one. It's a perfectly serviceable game on the PlayStation, but the Saturn version, although mostly the same, just feels a lot more responsive and fast to play. I wasn't fully aware of these differences prior to making this comparison either. It's fascinating that the first three games which we've compared between Saturn and PlayStation are all slightly better on Sega's machine. In time though, things would change.
Got what it takes to be amazing at Mahjong, brother?
Oh, Daddy Cool, you know it! Get the tables ready and break it up, because I'm gonna take you down!
Step into the ring and face me then, little man, because this is where the big boys play!
Oh, you won't even be able to withstand my sweet chin music. as this game packs music so good, it will want to make Yo-Yo Ma wanna mahjong all night long, baby.
You talk big, but can you withstand the action as I lift the brick towards the heavens as it gazes towards its impending impact under the basking sun and slam it right down through the table into the abyss?
Oh, you can take that brick, and you can shove it where the sunsoft doesn't shine, 'cause Chow Pong Kong John, there is no way you can beat me at Mahjong.
When the dust settles and the gong is rung, you will be sorely missed as I stand the victor.
Oh, it's a victor that you want. How about we raise the stakes? How about we up the ante? How about we drop the cage? How about we go Mahjong, Goku Tenjiku, from Electronic Arts Victor.
Bring it, brother. Journey to the east, journey to the west. You'll always lose against the best.
Let's go!
And yes, well, this is a Mahjong game as well.
Yes, it certainly is.
You say this is from Electronic Arts Victor?
Yes, but it was developed by Chat Noir, the same developer from the other Mahjong game.
Oh, I see. And it was available for the Sega Saturn, among other platforms as well.
Is it any better?
Well, let's see. No, it's exactly the same. I guess that's something, I suppose. They mastered multi-platform development at launch for both platforms.
John, you won't believe this, but they released an update for this game in 1999.
Wait, what?
Yup. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku 99.
Is it any better?
I mean, it looks slightly better.
Oh?
That's about it.
Brother.
Okay, so maybe it is worth expanding upon these titles briefly before we move on. Firstly, it's important to note that Mahjong games in general were hugely popular in Japan during this period, both in arcades and on home consoles. In the case of Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, it wasn't just on Saturn and PlayStation. There were also 3DO, Super Famicom, and even NEC PCFX versions of the game produced. And it was another entry in Chat Noir's already established series. This has to be one of the dumbest multi-platform comparisons in the history of this channel though. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku across all 5 platforms. There are subtle visual differences. Super Famicom runs at a lower resolution with fewer colors for instance, but the primary difference stems from the amount of time it takes the CPU opponents to make their move. Super Famicom also loses the CD quality soundtrack of course, sounds like an MSU1 patch waiting to happen. So it's a perfectly serviceable game of Mahjong, just with a bland presentation. Now Chat Noir's other game, produced by Sunsoft, was clearly banking more on the new hardware with its virtual mode. This is what we saw earlier with high quality 3D renders of colorful characters huddled around a Mahjong table. It's rather impressive to behold honestly, and was likely the big selling point here, but there's also a standard mode which displays the board in 2D. Unlike Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, this version uses the PlayStation's high-resolution interlaced mode and looks much sharper. So if you were all the way into Mahjong games in the mid-90s, Chat Noir had your back. They seemingly dominated the market when it came to Mahjong games. And there it is, the 1994 launch of the Sony PlayStation in Japan. These 8 games marked the beginning of what would go on to become one of the most successful gaming consoles ever released. Over the next few months, publishers would unleash a wide range of games across many genres as sales began to pick up. Yet, the race was still neck and neck between Saturn and PlayStation. This battle was just beginning, and thus the plans to launch PlayStation in the West got underway. Next week on DF Retro, we'll continue our journey through the launch of the original PlayStation. We'll discuss the history leading up to the launch date of 9/9/95. We'll examine each and every launch title, including games such as Rayman, NBA Jam Tournament Edition, ESPN Extreme Games, Street Fighter the Movie, Battle Arena Toshinden, and a whole lot more. So get ready for the North American launch of PlayStation next week.
Whoa, wait up. Didn't I cover the North American launch games for the PlayStation recently on my show GameSack? Are you moving in on my territory? Is that what's going on? Once a YouTuber does something and then another YouTuber does something even vaguely similar, that's copying. Them's the rules according to the comment section. Get your own ideas, Digital Foundry. People are already telling me that I copied my idea from Classic Gaming Quarterly. Which I did, but it's okay when I do it. It's definitely not okay when you do it because you have hundreds of subscribers more. Down with DF Retro, down with Digital Foundry, all 14 of you or however many there are, I really can't keep track. But you know what this means, right? That's right, YouTube war. The PlayStation launch games are mine to control and manipulate, not... Shut up! You have not seen the last of me, Digital Foundry. God, that stings.